Okay, dear friends, so we're going to tell a very interesting story today that is overlooked, but it does not appear in the parasha. It appears much earlier. Before we get to that story, we have to look at a pasuk that appears a few times in the parasha in different forms. And the discussion is a little difficult to understand, so much that the Gemara has to come along and help us fully understand what the pasuk is saying. So at the end of the parasha, and actually twice in the parasha, it tells us that we want to do mitzvot. Now that comes again and again. We kind of like jump over those pasukim because, we went to yeshiva, went to Jewish day school, we go to the classes. We know they have to do mitzvot. But it gives you a reason why. And the pasuk says in chapter Yud Aleph 11:22 Chavpet, Ki im shmot tishmor et kol mitzvah, if you do all the mitzvot, asher anochi mitzav etchem la'asota, that I've commanded you for you to actually do them, la'ahava, you're doing this to love et Hashem Elokech, the Lord your God, lalechet b'chol derachav, so that you can go in God's ways, you can follow God's ways, uledavka vo, and to cleave, davka, the modern Hebrew word devek, glue, comes from this word, uledavka vo, you will be able to cleave or attach yourself to God. Now, many parts of that pasuk we understand, right? God's commanded us the mitzvot. This is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking before the Jewish people go into the land of Israel. We know there's the mitzvah to love God. We already spoke about that in the Shema. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. You have to love the Lord your God. But now it's saying something very interesting. B'chol derachav. You have to go and follow God in all of His ways. What does this idea mean? B'chol derachav. And this expression appears a few times in the parasha and elsewhere in the Torah. What does that mean to follow, walk in God's ways? That's what it literally means. The derech, follow God's ways. So the Gemara says we have to learn from the midot of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God has various midot attributes. God does them. We should do them too. What are these divine, godly attributes that we are expected to follow? So the Gemara says, well, we learn that Kadosh Baruch Hu cares for people. He cares for us. He has rachmanut. Just as kachu rachum, just as He is merciful on people, so we too should be merciful to people. Just as Kadosh Baruch Hu clothed Adam and Chava in Gan Eden, we too should provide clothing for people as well. Just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu buries the dead, so too we, just He buried Moshe Rabbeinu and prepared his kavura, so too we should bury the dead as well. Just as HaKadosh Baruch Hu feeds people, as He did in the Midbar, so too we should feed people as well. Whatever God does, we do. We should emulate Hashem. That is what the Torah is telling us. Now, this is a little bit difficult to understand because the pasuk is talking about mitzvot, and then it says you should be like God, you should follow God's ways, and then it's saying what kind of ways? The way God treats us. God treats us well, you treat each other well. This would be rather unusual a statement, right? If you would think the way to follow God is to attach yourself to God, which the pasuk is telling us to do, then I should do mitzvot that are between me and God. How did it become this reality that the way we come close to God is by treating people well, by taking care of them, if they are having challenges in their lives, if they need tzedakah, if they need food? How did this come about? In other religions, lahavdil, the way you come close to God is by separating from people, not by attaching yourself to them. When you separate from people and come close to God, that's how you reach a high spiritual level. And yet we see over here, kimat, the exact opposite. So Moshe Rabbeinu is telling us these words, and obviously this idea predates Moshe Rabbeinu. How far back does it go? All the way back to Avram Avinu. So let's go back and look at a very interesting story and meet a very interesting individual who we kind of skip over when we talk about it. Well, we talk about him, but he's a very important individual we're actually going to learn a lot from. And it goes back to a war between Avram Avinu and 4 kings. We know that Lot Avram Avinu's nephew was kidnapped. He had left Avram Avinu, although he'd grown up in his home. He'd been adopted by Avram. He'd been given an amazing childhood and life from Avram and Sarah Imenu. And then he left in order to go live in Sodom, which was not a particularly good spiritual place to be. Why he went to Sodom is a very interesting question. And off he goes to Sodom. There is a war that takes place around that time between 4 kings and 5 kings. And these kings and their kingdoms are identified. The 4 kings beat the 5 kings, and in the process, Lot, Abraham's nephew, is kidnapped and taken. And Avram Avinu could have said, well, I didn't ask him to go live in Sodom. It's not my fault he went and got himself kidnapped by these individuals, these kings. But it doesn't say that. He takes it upon himself to rescue from a kidnapped state this man, Lot, this perplexing hero, which is how the Art Scroll describes him. Perplexing because he's good, and yet he's getting up to, he's living in a very unusual location. So Avram goes, and he takes an army. Some say he literally has an army with him, and some say no, the army actually consisted of one individual, Eliezer, his servant, and he goes and rescues him. After this war, and this is the interesting part, after this war, we meet an individual called Malchi Tzedek. And this is in the book of, in Sefer Bereshit, in Lech Lecha, chapter 14, verse 18. And it says that this person, Malchi Tzedek, comes to greet Avram Avinu after this war. He's fought, he's rescued. I mean, the idea of rescuing people who've been kidnapped is a tremendous mitzvah, as we know. And what does he do? This Malchi Tzedek, with the word Malchi Tzedek, means he's the king of righteousness. Actually, he's the king of Yerushalayim. He's the king of Yerushalayim. And actually, that's not his real name was Shem. He was one of the sons of Noach. Actually, he was a great-great-grandfather of Avram Avinu himself, right? He was actually a descendant of his. And he had made himself, or would become, through his righteous actions, the king of Tzedek, which is Yerushalayim. Right? Shalem comes from the word Shalom, Yerushalayim. He was a king of Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem at this point, at that time, wasn't much. It really wasn't anything at all. It was this individual and Abraham's actions on this mountain that makes him so incredibly important. It's going to become the future site of the Beit HaMikdash. Avram Avinu is going to raise it up, right? We're going to have the whole Akedat Yitzchak taking place over there, and Yaakov Avinu is going to have his dream and say it's Shara Shemayim of the ladder. It's going to happen over there as well. So there's a lot happening.
It's also a proof that Israel is ours.
100%. Not just this, Hebron too. But this is really one of the first locations we see in Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, the future place of the temple that takes on prominence at this time. The bit that I'm always surprised about is that this holy Kohen, he's called a priest, he's Melech Tzedek, he's the king of Jerusalem and Harabayit, and he comes out and he makes a special feast for Avram Avinu. What does he bring him? Lechem and yayin, bread and wine. You know what's incredible about this? He is considered to be one of the great individuals, a holy person. You would have thought that he would have sent his servants or some other people to take on the mitzvah of feeding, making a kiddush for Avram Avinu after this incredible battle that Avram Avinu has gone through. And yet Malchi Tzedek, his appearance in the Torah appears in one way, not as a great spiritual person who's worshipping God, but by being a person who makes a feast, who helps the war-weary Avram Avinu after this war of rescuing and bringing Avram Avinu food, a su'udah, after this entire battle. It's unbelievable. This is the midah that Moshe Rabbeinu, this trait that Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about in our parsha. How do we become like God? By following God's ways. Well, what does God do? He takes care of people. He feeds us. He clothes us. He buries us. This is the way we're meant to be. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has these traits. We have to emulate the traits of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so the most righteous people, Avram and Malchi Tzedek in their day, and Moshe Rabbeinu is testifying to this, are people who take... How do we come close to God? By taking care of each other. And it reminds me so much. I heard this idea, and I thought, wow, look at these soldiers who are rescuing kidnapped individuals. Tremendous mitzvah, probably the greatest mitzvah. You can break all the laws of the Torah, even Shabbat, in order to bring a kidnapped individual back to the safety of their home. And all these individuals are coming and they're feeding them. And you see these Rabbanim. I was there myself, Baruch Hashem. I was there a couple of months back. They're making barbecues and they're feeding these soldiers when they get out, when they get a little bit of respite after these wars. This concept goes back thousands of years. This is the midah of Malchi Tzedek. This is the midah of Avraham Avinu, who rescues kidnapped individuals. And Moshe Rabbeinu is saying, that's how you walk in the ways of God. You walk in the ways of God by finding people who've been kidnapped and bringing them home. You follow the ways of God by feeding the soldiers. That's why Malchi Tzedek fed Avraham Avinu bread and wine. Now we make barbecues, ala esh. Every Israeli gets out their own mangal, they love their barbecue. All of this is walking b'darachea, in the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is the most holy way that a person can act, says the Torah. That's how you walk in God's ways.